Mid-September, 1945. A converted cargo truck rumbles down a dusty Texas road carrying two German women who'd been taught America was starving, broken, barely surviving its own war. Greta and Liesel step into a small-town grocery store, and their breath catches. Shelves stretching endlessly. Canned peaches stacked to the ceiling. Fresh bread. Real butter. Mountains of sugar, coffee, chocolate. No ration cards. No lines. No hunger. An American mother strolls past, casually selecting 3 kinds of jam while her daughter whines about cereal choices. Liesel's hands start shaking. "So much food," she whispers, because everything they'd been told, every sacrifice, every loss, every reason they'd believed in, just shattered in a single aisle of abundance. One apple, offered freely, tasted like the truth they'd been denied for 12 years. Before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories that history tried to bury, smash that subscribe button. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The summer heat pressed down on the port of New York like a weight that had no intention of lifting. It was mid-July 1945, and the war in Europe had been over for 2 months, though the machinery of its aftermath ground on with brutal efficiency. On the deck of a converted cargo ship that still smelled faintly of engine oil and rust, 200 German women stood in loose formation, their faces carefully blank, their postures held just shy of military attention. They were prisoners of war, though most of them had never held a weapon. Nurses, clerks, telegraph operators, kitchen staff. Women who had served the Reich in 1,000 small ways and now found themselves classified as enemy combatants, property to be transferred across an ocean to a country they'd been taught to fear. Greta Muller stood near the railing, her hands folded in front of her, her back straight despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like winter cold. At 37, she was older than most of the women around her, and her face showed it. Hollow cheeks, shadows under her eyes that no amount of sleep would erase, a tightness around her mouth that came from holding words back for so long they'd fossilized. She'd been a Red Cross nurse, had spent 4 years patching bodies back together in field hospitals that moved with the front lines, had learned to work through the screaming and the dying until her hands moved with the mechanical precision of someone who'd locked her heart away in a place feelings couldn't reach it. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front in 1943. She'd received the telegram while elbow deep in someone else's blood, had read it twice to make sure she understood, then folded it into her pocket and returned to the surgery. There would be time to fall apart later. There was always later. Below deck, in the dim converted cargo hold that served as their quarters, Liesel Hartmann whispered to anyone who would listen. She was 22, blonde, thin as a rail, with the kind of fierce energy that came from believing absolutely in something even when that something was crumbling. She'd been a youth leader, had organized rallies and marches, had taught younger girls to recite slogans about duty and sacrifice and the glory of the fatherland. Now she clung to those slogans like a drowning person clings to driftwood, her voice low and urgent in the stuffy darkness. "They'll work us to death. Americans are barbarians. They only feed their own. Stay strong. Stay loyal. Don't forget who we are." Some of the women nodded. Others turned away, too tired for ideology, too hungry for hope. When the order came to disembark, Greta moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that obedience was the path of least resistance. She carried nothing but a small canvas bag containing a change of clothes, a comb, and a photograph of her daughter Anna that she couldn't bring herself to look at. The gangplank swayed slightly under her feet. American soil felt no different than any other soil. Solid, indifferent. She'd expected chaos, shouting, perhaps rough handling. What she got instead was a female American guard with tired eyes and a clipboard directing them toward a processing area with the weary patience of someone who'd done this 100 times before. And then she saw the sandwiches. A table had been set up near the dock, staffed by 2 more guards and what looked like volunteers from some civilian organization. They were distributing food to the disembarking prisoners. Not slop, not watery soup or moldy bread. Actual sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, each one thick with what looked like real meat and fresh lettuce. Greta's hand trembled as she accepted hers. She didn't unwrap it immediately. Instead, she held it, feeling the weight of it, the slight warmth still radiating from whatever kitchen had prepared it. This doesn't match what we were told. The thought arrived unbidden. Dangerous. She pushed it down, wrapped it in the same mental discipline she used to wrap surgical instruments. Don't think. Just survive. The train to Texas was clean. Too clean. Greta sat by a window watching the American countryside roll past in shades of green that seemed obscene in their richness. No bomb craters, no burned-out villages, no refugees trudging along the roadside with everything they owned tied in bundles on their backs. Just fields and farms and small towns that looked like they'd never heard of war. Liesl sat beside her, rigid with suspicion, pointing out what she claimed were signs of hidden suffering. See how small those houses are? They must be starving inside them. See how few cars? They've run out of fuel, just like we heard. Greta didn't argue. She just watched the landscape and tried not to think about what it meant that a country could fight a war on two fronts and still have fields full of crops and towns full of intact buildings. They arrived at Camp Swift, Texas in the late afternoon when the heat had reached its peak and the air shimmered above the dusty ground. Rows of tidy barracks stretched in neat lines, surrounded by farmland that rolled toward a horizon so wide it made Greta's chest ache. The sky was impossibly blue, unmarked by smoke or ash. They were processed again, assigned barracks, given work details, not mines, not factories, the camp hospital laundry and kitchen. They would earn wages, small, but wages nonetheless. Greta listened to the orientation with the part of her brain that still functioned, filed the information away, and tried not to feel the dangerous flutter of something that might have been hope. That night, a letter caught up with her. It had been forwarded through 3 different offices, stamped and restamped, the envelope soft with handling. The International Red Cross logo in the corner, dated 6 months prior. Greta sat on her narrow bunk and opened it with fingers that had suddenly forgotten how to be steady. The words blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. Her daughter Anna, age 14, who Greta had believed safe with her sister in Bavaria, had never arrived there. Lost in the chaos of the evacuation. Presumed dead in the Dresden bombings. Greta sat very still. Around her, other women prepared for sleep, their voices a low murmur of exhaustion and cautious relief. Liesl was already asleep nearby, muttering something about American lies even in her dreams. Greta looked down at the letter in her hands, at the careful bureaucratic language that delivered devastation in neat, typed lines. She crumpled it slowly, feeling the paper compress in her fist, and stared at nothing. What was it all for? The question arrived like a blade between her ribs. All the discipline, all the service, all the years of believing that suffering had purpose if you just endured it properly. Anna was gone, and Greta was still here, still breathing, still surviving. For what? The days blurred together in a rhythm that was almost merciful in its predictability. Wake at 6. Roll call. Breakfast that was plain but adequate. Work detail. Lunch. More work. Dinner. Lights out at 9. Greta moved through it all with the mechanical efficiency she'd perfected over years of field hospitals and grief, her hands knowing what to do even when her mind wandered to places she couldn't afford to go. The camp hospital laundry was housed in a converted storage building that smelled perpetually of bleach and steam, and she worked there 6 days a week sorting and washing linens that came down from the medical wing stained with blood and worse. It was familiar work, almost comforting in its grimness. She knew how to make white things white again, how to get death out of cotton. She'd been doing it for years. Liesl worked in the kitchens, peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots alongside a dozen other women who still couldn't quite believe they were being fed 3 meals a day. She remained brittle with suspicion, her voice sharp whenever someone expressed gratitude or relief. Don't trust it. They're fattening us up for something. This is how they break you. She said it often enough that some of the younger women started to believe her, started to see manipulation in every small kindness, conspiracy in every adequate meal. Greta heard the whispers but said nothing. She was too tired to argue about hope when she had none left herself. The American guard who supervised their work detail was a woman in her mid-40s named Sergeant Ruth Wagner, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. She was German-American, her accent slight but unmistakable when she gave instructions, and there was something in her face that suggested she understood more than she said. She'd lost someone in the war. Greta could tell. It was in the set of her mouth, the way she looked at the prisoners sometimes with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite hardness either. Something more complicated. Something that knew grief from the inside. Ruth noticed things. She noticed which women were struggling, which ones hoarded bread in their pockets, which ones woke screaming from nightmares they couldn't talk about. She noticed Greta's hollow efficiency, the way she worked without pause or complaint, but also without any spark of presence, as if she'd evacuated her own body and left just enough behind to keep it functional. One afternoon in early August, when the Texas heat had turned the laundry room into something close to torture, Ruth brought Greta a cup of coffee. Not the bitter chicory substitute that had passed for coffee in Germany for the last 3 years. Real coffee, dark and rich and smelling like a memory of normalcy. "You did good work today." Ruth said it simply, without ceremony, and set the cup down on the folding table where Greta sorted stained sheets. Then she just stood there, not demanding conversation, not requiring gratitude, just present in a way that suggested she had nowhere else she needed to be. Greta wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat of it seep into her palms. She didn't drink it right away. Instead, she heard herself mention Anna. Just once. Just the bare facts. "My daughter. 14. Dresden." The words came out flat, surgical, as if she were reporting on someone else's loss. Ruth nodded. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She didn't say she was sorry or suggest that time would heal or promise that things would get better. She just pulled up a crate and sat down beside Greta for 5 minutes in silence, drinking her own coffee, 2 women sharing space with their grief. Liesl saw the exchange from across the laundry room where she'd come to deliver a cart of kitchen towels. Her face went rigid with something between betrayal and fear. That evening, back in the barracks after dinner, she confronted Greta with the kind of desperate intensity that came from watching your certainties crumble. "You're being soft. You're letting them get to you. They're the enemy. Don't forget what they did. Don't forget what they're capable of." Her voice rose with each sentence, drawing the attention of other women who sat on nearby bunks, their faces carefully neutral, unwilling to take sides in a fight that might cost them whatever fragile peace they'd found. Greta looked at Liesl and felt nothing but exhaustion. The enemy. The words had lost all meaning. Who was the enemy now? The Americans who fed them and paid them wages and brought them coffee? The regime that had sent her husband to die in a frozen wasteland and her daughter to burn in a firestorm? The propaganda that had promised glory and delivered only ash? Herself for believing it long enough to end up here? She didn't have the energy to explain any of this to Liesl, didn't have the words to articulate the way her understanding of the world had shattered and reformed into something she didn't yet recognize. So she just turned away, lay down on her bunk, and stared at the ceiling until Liesl's anger burned itself out into something quieter and more afraid. The weeks continued. Summer pressed down on Texas with relentless heat, and the women adapted the way people always adapt, finding small rhythms, small mercies, small reasons to keep going. Some of them started to relax, started to believe that maybe survival here didn't require constant vigilance. They laughed occasionally. They taught each other card games. They complained about the heat and the work and the boredom with the casual frustration of people who weren't starving or dying, who had space in their minds for ordinary irritations. Greta watched it all from a distance, neither participating nor judging, just observing the way life insisted on continuing even when it felt obscene to let it. Ruth continued her quiet supervision, firm but fair, correcting mistakes without cruelty, acknowledging good work without making it feel like manipulation. She brought Greta coffee 3 more times over the following weeks, never with any expectation of conversation, just a simple gesture that said she saw Greta as a person rather than a category labeled enemy or prisoner. Greta began to wonder in the small hours before dawn, when sleep wouldn't come, whether she'd been wrong about everything. Not just about the war or the propaganda or the promises that had turned to poison, but about something more fundamental, about whether mercy was real or just another kind of weapon, about whether the space between enemy and human could ever be bridged, or whether the gap was permanent, carved too deep by too much blood to ever cross again. She didn't have answers. But the questions themselves felt dangerous, felt like the first crack in ice that had been frozen solid for so long she'd forgotten what water looked like underneath. Mid-September arrived with a slight cooling of the Texas heat, enough to make outdoor work bearable instead of punishing. A small group of prisoners had been selected for community relief work, a program that allowed supervised excursions to help with civilian projects in the nearby town. It was a test of sorts, a measure of trust extended cautiously to women who'd proven themselves cooperative and reliable. Greta and Liesel were both chosen, along with 8 others, and they climbed into the back of a military truck one Saturday morning with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Ruth drove, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes watching the road with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. The town was small. The kind of place that looked like it had been there forever and would continue being there long after everyone currently living had turned to dust. White church steeple, main street with a handful of shops, houses with front porches and American flags hanging limp in the still air. They spent the morning at the church sorting donated clothing, separating winter coats from summer dresses, folding everything into neat piles that would be distributed to families whose men hadn't come home or whose farms had failed or whose luck had simply run dry. It was good work, useful work, and some of the women seemed almost happy doing it, chatting quietly in German as they worked, allowing themselves to forget for a few hours that they were prisoners in a foreign country. On the way back to camp, Ruth stopped the truck outside a small grocery store. She needed to pick up supplies for the camp kitchen, she explained, and told the women to stay in the truck bed where benches had been installed. But the store owner, an older man with kind eyes and grief written in every line of his face, came out when he saw them. "It's hot," he said to Ruth. "Let them come in. They can get water." He said it simply, without ceremony, as if offering water to enemy prisoners was the most natural thing in the world. Ruth hesitated, then nodded. The women climbed down from the truck, moving slowly, uncertain whether this was real or some kind of test. Greta stepped through the doorway into a world that made no sense. The store stretched wider than seemed possible from the outside, aisles reaching back into carefully organized abundance. Shelves stacked floor to ceiling with canned goods, their labels bright and cheerful. Fresh apples piled in wooden crates, their skins shining under fluorescent lights. Bread wrapped in waxed paper, loaves of it, white in wheat and something that looked like it had raisins. Real butter in a refrigerated case, sugar in 5-pound bags, coffee in tins with pictures of mountains on them, chocolate bars stacked in cardboard displays, meat wrapped in clean white paper behind a counter where a butcher in a stained apron smiled at a customer and asked how thick she wanted her pork chops. Liesel froze in the middle of the aisle. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first, then barely a whisper. "So much food!" Her voice cracked on the last word, turning it into something between a question and an accusation. Greta felt her chest tighten, felt something in her throat that might have been a sob, or might have been a laugh, or might have been the sound of everything she'd believed finally breaking apart. She'd seen bread lines in Berlin that stretched for blocks. She'd watched neighbors fight over potato peelings. She'd held Anna's last letter, the one that arrived 3 months before Dresden, where her daughter had written in careful script about being hungry, about dreaming of real butter, about wondering if they'd have potatoes for Christmas. An American woman walked past them, a child holding her hand, and selected 3 jars of jam from a shelf that held at least 20 different varieties. Strawberry, raspberry, apricot, grape. The little girl whined that she wanted a different cereal, pointing at a box with a cartoon character on it, her voice rising in the particular pitch of a child who'd never known want and couldn't understand why her mother wouldn't buy both kinds. The mother sighed, exasperated by abundance, annoyed by choices. She put one box back and took another, and the girl pouted but accepted it, already forgetting what she'd been upset about. Greta's mind flashed through images she couldn't stop. The propaganda films they'd been shown, the ones that claimed America was suffering too, that American children were starving while their leaders grew fat, that the war was destroying them just as much as it was destroying Europe. The speeches about how Germany was fighting for survival against nations that wanted to crush them into poverty and submission. The promises that sacrifice now would mean plenty later, that if they just held on, just believed, just gave everything they had, there would be a future worth the price. All lies, all of it. This country had fought a war on 2 fronts, had sent millions of men across 2 oceans, had built tanks and planes and ships in numbers that seemed impossible, and still had grocery stores full of food that nobody rationed, that nobody fought over, that nobody died without. Ruth stood near the doorway watching them, her face unreadable. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The truth was stacked on every shelf, piled in every crate, wrapped in every package. Liesel's hands started to shake. "They told us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They said America was struggling. They said we were all suffering together. They said—" Tears streaked her face, carving lines through the dust and grime of the truck ride, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Other women from their group had filtered into the store now, and their faces showed the same stunned comprehension, the same dawning horror of understanding how completely they'd been deceived. The store owner approached them quietly. This man, named Henry, whose son had died on a beach somewhere in the Pacific fighting against the country these women had served. He held out apples, one for each of them, his hands weathered and steady. "On the house," he said. His eyes were sad but not cruel, tired but not hard. He knew what he was doing. He knew what this moment meant. And he chose mercy anyway. Greta took the apple he offered, felt the weight of it in her palm, smooth and cool and impossibly perfect. She tried to say thank you, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with grief and shame and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. On the ride back to camp, Liesel stared at her apple, turning it over and over in her hands but not biting into it, as if eating it would make everything real in a way she wasn't ready to accept. Greta took one small bite of hers. It tasted like ash. Not because it was bad, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it represented every lie she'd been told, every sacrifice that now felt hollow, every loss that might have been avoided if someone, anyone, had chosen truth instead of glory. The apple was perfect, and that perfection was the cruelest thing she'd ever tasted. The weeks after the grocery store trip brought a shift that Greta could feel but couldn't quite name. It was subtle, like the way light changes in the minutes before sunset. The world not yet dark but no longer bright, caught in that in-between place where everything looks different than it did an hour before. The women talked less about when the war would truly end, when they'd be sent home, when things would go back to normal. Instead, they talked about small things, the weather, the work, a joke someone had heard. They were learning, slowly and painfully, to live in the present tense, to stop waiting for a future that might never match the past they'd lost. Greta found herself volunteering more often in the camp hospital, not just washing linens, but assisting the medical staff when they needed an extra pair of trained hands. She'd been a nurse too long to forget how, and the American doctors quickly learned they could trust her with wound care, with medication distribution, with the kind of unglamorous work that kept a field hospital running. They treated her with professional respect, asking her opinion on treatment plans, thanking her when a shift ended, including her in the casual conversations that happened during quiet moments between emergencies. It felt strange. Not bad, just strange. Like wearing shoes that fit, but still felt new. She wrote a letter to the International Red Cross, her handwriting careful and precise, asking them to search again for Anna. Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe the records were incomplete. Maybe her daughter was alive somewhere in the chaos of post-war Europe, lost but not gone, waiting but not found. Greta didn't let herself hope too hard. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you worse than despair ever could. But she wrote the letter anyway, folded it into an envelope, and handed it to Ruth to mail. Ruth took it without comment. Just a small nod that said she understood what it cost to ask for something you'd already been told was impossible. Liesel stopped reciting party slogans. It happened gradually, so slowly that Greta didn't notice until she realized she hadn't heard them in days. The younger woman still struggled, still had moments where her face would go hard and her jaw would set and you could see her fighting the urge to say something about loyalty or duty or not forgetting who they were. But she was fighting it now instead of surrendering to it, and that seemed like progress. She and Greta sat together sometimes in the evenings, not talking much, just sharing space the way Ruth had shared space with Greta over coffee. Sometimes that was enough. The American staff began to feel less like guards and more like colleagues, at least to some of the women who were willing to let that shift happen. Ruth brought photographs one afternoon, spreading them on the work table during a break. Her nephew, 20 years old, blonde hair and a wide smile, wearing his uniform like it was the most important thing he'd ever done. "He died at Normandy," Ruth said quietly. "First wave." She didn't say it to punish them or to make them feel guilty. She said it the way you'd talk about the weather, just stating a fact that was true and heavy and permanent. Greta looked at the photograph of this boy who died killing people who looked like her husband, who'd served the same cause her country had served, and she didn't know what to feel. Grief, maybe. But grief for whom? For this American boy she'd never met? For her own losses? For the whole stupid waste of it all? There was even humor sometimes, gentle and tentative, but real. Greta taught Ruth how to make proper German potato dumplings one afternoon in the camp kitchen when the regular staff needed help preparing dinner. Ruth's first attempt fell apart in the boiling water, turning into starchy mush, and she laughed at herself with the kind of self-deprecation that suggested she didn't take herself too seriously. "My Oma would be ashamed," she said, and Greta found herself almost smiling, showing Ruth how to work the dough with lighter hands, how to shape it properly, how to test if it was ready. It was a small thing, cooking together, but it felt like building a bridge across an ocean one plank at a time. The tension that had wound so tight in those first weeks began to ease. Not gone, not forgotten, but loosened enough to breathe. The women formed friendships across the divisions that had seemed so absolute before. They shared stories about home, about families, about who they'd been before the war turned everyone into categories and enemies. They were still prisoners. They still wore identification badges. They still lived behind fences and followed rules and had their movements controlled. But within those constraints, something like community was forming, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. Then a new transport arrived. 50 more German POWs from a processing center up north. Women who'd been held in harsher conditions, who hadn't yet had time to adjust to the strange mercy of Camp Swift. Among them was Frau Margarete Keitel, a woman in her mid-50s who carried herself like royalty even in prison clothes, her chin high, her eyes sharp and assessing, cataloging who deferred and who might need to be reminded of their place. She'd been a district leader in the Nazi Women's League, had organized youth programs and charity drives and all the machinery of civilian support that kept the war machine running. She'd lost both her sons and her husband, and instead of breaking under that weight, she'd hardened, doubling down on belief because the alternative was admitting it had all been for nothing. Frau Keitel moved through the camp like winter moving through a garden, killing small green things wherever she went. She spoke in the mess hall about maintaining dignity, about not forgetting who they were, about the danger of letting the enemy soften them with false kindness. She found the women who were still angry, still bitter, still clinging to the old certainties, and she gave them permission to stay that way. She found the women who'd started to relax. who'd started to hope, who'd started to see their captors as something other than monsters, and she planted seeds of doubt. This is all a show. The real camps, the ones for men, are death camps. They're treating you well because they want something. They're manipulating you, testing you, waiting to see who breaks first. Liesel began to waver. Greta could see it in the way the younger woman watched Frau Keitel speak, the way she nodded along with certain points, the way her face would harden again into the expression she'd worn when they first arrived. "What if she's right?" Liesel asked one night, her voice small and afraid. "What if the food and the kindness are just manipulation? What if we're being softened up so we'll betray everything we believed in?" Greta didn't have a good answer. She wasn't sure anymore what betrayal meant or what belief was worth, or whether the old certainties deserved to be defended or deserved to die. Then Frau Keitel discovered that Greta had written to the Red Cross. Someone had seen the letter, had mentioned it in conversation, and the information had traveled the way information always travels in close quarters until it reached the wrong ears. Frau Keitel stood up during dinner one evening, her voice cutting through the casual conversation like a blade through cloth. "We have a traitor among us, a collaborator, someone who's been working with the Americans, who's been accepting their charity, who's forgotten what loyalty means." She pointed at Greta, her finger steady, her face righteous with certainty. "This woman has been corresponding with enemy organizations. She's been helping them in their hospital. She's been teaching them our recipes. She's selling us out piece by piece." The mess hall went silent. 200 women stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped moving. They looked at Greta, and in their faces she saw suspicion, confusion, fear, judgment. The fragile community that had been forming cracked right down the middle. Some of the women who'd worked alongside Greta, who'd laughed with her, who'd started to trust her, now looked away. They didn't defend her. They didn't speak up. They just looked away, and that silence felt worse than any accusation. Liesel sat frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes moving between Frau Keitel and Greta, torn between two versions of truth that couldn't both be right. Greta said nothing. There was nothing to say that would matter. She finished her dinner slowly, every bite deliberately calm, every movement controlled, refusing to give Frau Keitel the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Then she stood, cleared her tray, and walked back to the barracks alone. Behind her, the mess hall erupted into whispered conversations, opinions forming and hardening. The community she'd barely begun to trust fracturing into factions and suspicions and all the old fears dressed up in new clothes. That night, lying on her bunk in the darkness, Greta stared at the ceiling and felt the isolation settle over her like a shroud. Even Liesel wouldn't sit with her. The younger woman had chosen a bunk across the room, her back turned, her silence louder than any accusation. In her locker, the withered core of the apple from the grocery store sat wrapped in paper, a memento of a truth that suddenly felt very far away. Maybe Frau Keitel was right. Maybe truth didn't matter when survival was all that was left. Maybe mercy was just another word for manipulation. Maybe hope was just the cruelest lie of all. The days after the mess hall confrontation passed in a gray fog that had nothing to do with Texas weather. Greta stopped volunteering at the hospital. She stopped trying. She moved through her required work shifts with the minimum effort necessary to avoid punishment, folding laundry with mechanical precision, her mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere distant and numb where feelings couldn't reach. Ruth noticed. Of course she noticed. She left small kindnesses on Greta's workstation. An extra blanket when the nights turned cooler, a cup of coffee that appeared during afternoon shift, a quiet word of thanks for work completed. Greta didn't acknowledge any of it. She couldn't. Acknowledgement meant caring, and caring meant breaking, and she'd already broken too many times to survive another shattering. Frau Keitel's poison spread through the camp like frost across glass, beautiful and deadly and impossible to stop once it started. The women became colder, more withdrawn, more suspicious of every American kindness. They stopped the casual conversations with guards. They stopped smiling at small jokes. They stopped participating in anything beyond what was strictly required. The community that had been tentatively forming collapsed back into the rigid hierarchies of fear and loyalty, with Frau Keitel at the center like a spider in a web, watching who deferred and who resisted, rewarding compliance with approval and punishing doubt with isolation. October arrived with cooler temperatures and shorter days. The Texas landscape turned golden in the afternoons, the light slanting through the barracks windows at angles that reminded Greta of autumn in Germany, of seasons changing, of time passing whether you were ready for it or not. She lay on her bunk during free time, staring at nothing, thinking about nothing, existing in that space beyond grief where even numbness requires too much energy. Other women gave her a wide berth, not hostile exactly, just careful, as if whatever had infected her might be contagious, as if collaboration or treason or simple exhaustion could spread through proximity. Then one morning in mid-October, a Red Cross representative arrived at Camp Swift. Greta was called to the camp office, summoned by a guard who wouldn't meet her eyes, who clearly thought this was some kind of punishment or interrogation. Greta walked across the compound with her heart doing nothing, expecting nothing, prepared for nothing except more confirmation that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The office was small and plain, dominated by a metal desk and filing cabinets and the kind of institutional efficiency that turned people into paperwork. The Red Cross representative was a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a folder full of documents. "Your daughter is alive." The words didn't make sense at first. Greta heard them but couldn't process them, couldn't fit them into the reality she'd constructed over the past months. Anna Muller, age 14, she'd been evacuated east ahead of the bombing, got separated in the chaos, ended up in the Soviet zone. The Red Cross found her in a refugee camp in the British sector. "She's asking for you." The woman slid a telegram across the desk, a thin piece of paper covered in typed words that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to Greta's frozen mind. "Reunification will take time. Months, probably. But it's possible. She's alive, and she's asking for you." Greta walked back to the barracks in a daze, the telegram folded in her pocket, her legs moving automatically while her brain tried to catch up with what had just happened. She sat on her bunk, pulled out the telegram, read it again to make sure she hadn't imagined it or misunderstood or allowed hope to trick her into seeing words that weren't there. But they were there. Every time she read it, they were still there. Anna Muller, alive, British sector, requesting reunification with mother. The tears came silently, streaming down her face without sound, without drama, just water escaping from a place where it had been held too long under too much pressure. Liesl noticed. She'd been sitting on her own bunk across the room mending a shirt, carefully not looking at Greta, maintaining the distance that Frau Keitel's accusations had created. But she noticed the tears, and something in her face shifted. She set down her mending and crossed the room slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching something fragile that might shatter if she moved too quickly. She sat on the edge of Greta's bunk. "What is it?" Her voice was soft, tentative, nothing like the fierce certainty she'd carried in those early weeks. Greta couldn't speak. She just handed Liesl the telegram. Liesl read it once, then again, her lips moving slightly as she processed the words. Then she looked at Greta and her eyes were shining with tears too. "I was wrong." The words came out barely above a whisper. Frau Keitel was wrong. The apple was real. The food was real. And now this is real. She gestured at the telegram, at proof that mercy could exist even in a world that seemed designed to crush it. They didn't have to help you search for her. They didn't have to tell you. They didn't have to do any of this. But they did. And that means something. That has to mean something. That evening in the mess hall, Frau Keitel began another tirade. She stood at her usual table, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority, speaking about maintaining dignity, about not being seduced by enemy kindness, about remembering who they were and what they owed to the fallen. The women around her nodded, some of them genuinely convinced, others just too tired to resist, going along because resistance required energy they didn't have. But this time, Liesl stood up. "Enough." The word cut through Frau Keitel's speech like a knife through silk. The room went silent. Every face turned toward Liesel, this young woman who'd been one of Frau Keitel's most vocal supporters, who'd nodded along with every speech, who'd helped spread the suspicion and fear. Liesel's hands were shaking, but her voice held steady. I went to that store. I saw the food. Rows and rows of it. More food than I'd seen in 5 years. And I've seen how they treat us here. With more decency than we were shown at home sometimes. With more mercy than we probably deserve. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. I don't know what it all means. I don't know how to make sense of any of it. I don't know how to reconcile what we were told with what we're seeing, but I know that lying to ourselves won't bring anyone back, won't rebuild anything, won't make the losses mean something they didn't mean. We can keep clinging to the old lies because they're familiar, because they're comfortable, because admitting we were wrong about everything is too painful. Or we can accept that maybe, just maybe, we were lied to about more than we want to admit. Greta stood up too. Slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her. She didn't say anything. She just stood there beside Liesel, a quiet statement of solidarity, of choosing truth over comfort, of refusing to let fear and suspicion be the final word. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then another woman stood, one of the older ones who'd worked in the kitchens, who'd seen the abundance, who'd been softening before Frau Keitel arrived. Then another. Then 3 more. Not everyone, not even half, but enough. Enough to break Frau Keitel's absolute authority. Enough to show that the old certainties didn't have to be the only option. Frau Keitel's face went rigid with fury. She spat words about traitors and collaborators and women who'd forgotten their duty, her voice rising to a pitch that sounded more desperate than authoritative. But her power was broken. The women who'd stood remained standing. The women who'd stayed seated looked uncertain rather than convinced. The absolute unity she'd been building cracked right down the middle, and through that crack, something else began to grow. Not certainty, not even hope exactly, just possibility, just the fragile acknowledgement that maybe there was more than one way to understand what had happened to them, more than one way to move forward from this wreckage. The weeks that followed brought a gradual thawing. Greta was approved for transfer to a civilian internment facility where family reunification was prioritized. She'd see Anna in the spring, they told her. Maybe April, maybe May. It depended on transportation, on paperwork, on all the bureaucratic machinery that ground slowly but ground nonetheless. She began to prepare, not just practically but emotionally, trying to imagine who her daughter had become in the months they'd been apart, what stories Anna would tell, what scars she'd carry, how they'd learned to be mother and daughter again after everything that had tried to break them. Early December brought snow to Texas, just a dusting, barely enough to stick, but enough to transform the camp into something that looked almost peaceful in the early morning light. Greta packed her few possessions into a canvas bag, the same one she'd carried off the ship in July. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like yesterday. Liesel sat with her, helping fold clothes that didn't need folding, drawing out the last moments they'd have together. What will you tell her? Liesel asked quietly. About all this? About what happened here? Greta folded the borrowed sweater Ruth had given her, running her hands over the soft wool. The truth, that sometimes the people we're told to hate show us more mercy than we deserve. That sometimes the stories we're told are designed to keep us from seeing clearly. That healing begins when we stop lying to ourselves about what we were part of. That our daughter is alive because people who had every reason to stop caring chose to keep searching. She looked at Liesel. And that we get to choose what kind of people we become after this. The war made us into enemies. But what comes next, that's up to us. Ruth drove Greta to the train station in the same truck that had taken them to the grocery store, the one where everything had changed. Before Greta boarded, Ruth handed her a small bag. Apples, fresh bread, a jar of strawberry jam from that impossible store. For the journey. Her voice was gruff, emotion carefully controlled, but her eyes were gentle. Greta took the bag, met Ruth's gaze, and found words that felt inadequate but true. Thank you. For everything. For the coffee. For the silence. For not giving up on believing we could be more than what we were taught to be. Ruth nodded. Go find your daughter. Tell her the world's got a chance to be better than it was. Tell her that's worth fighting for. The train pulled away slowly, gathering speed, carrying Greta toward a future she couldn't quite imagine but could finally allow herself to want. She looked back at the camp, at Ruth standing on the platform, at Texas spreading golden under winter light. She thought about the grocery store, about shelves full of abundance, about small kindnesses that cracked understanding, about the courage it took to accept that everything you believed might have been a lie. She thought, maybe this is what peace looks like. Not the absence of war, but the presence of truth. And the courage to accept it even when it cost everything you thought you knew. In her bag, the apple was crisp and perfect. She would save it for Anna. She would tell her daughter about the grocery store, about the impossible food, about the people who'd shown mercy when they didn't have to. She would tell her that healing was possible, that truth was stronger than lies, and that sometimes the hardest thing and the bravest thing were exactly the same. The apple in her bag was a promise. Not that everything would be easy, not that the scars would disappear, but that they could choose every day to build something better from the rubble of what had been destroyed. That was enough. That would have to be enough. And maybe, just maybe, it was more than enough. Maybe it was everything.